Okay, so I think at this point it's enough really from me. And the first, just to go back a couple of slides here, the first speaker is our keynote speaker this morning, Cameron Naylan. And I'll leave Cameron to introduce where he's from at the moment. But he'll be talking about the idea of science as a service from here. So Cameron, over to you.
So thanks, Martin. Thanks for the invitation to speak. So yes, I am between affiliations at the moment. This has put me in a slightly odd position in as much as up until 2 weeks ago I was working for Science and Technology Facilities Council. In a couple of weeks I'll be working for the Public Library of Science. So I'm not speaking for either of those, but there are people in both who'll get annoyed at me if I say something too radical, which I will try and avoid doing. But nonetheless, I do want to be a little bit radical. So my aim is to finish speaking when that clock says 1:45, plus or minus 2 minutes. My aim is to give you a different way of thinking about the way we do research globally, for those of you who perhaps aren't as familiar with software engineering practice. And for those of you who are, I hope to challenge you to think about how you can apply that thinking more generally to the processes beyond the software and its management itself, to the wider area of research. So what I've just done is taken a test-driven design approach to this talk. At the end of this talk, you will be able to judge whether I have passed my tests. You will also note that I'm not using any slides, so I'm using the standard library. Without any additional modules. That comes with its own risks. It reduces the functionality somewhat, but it also gives me a little bit more flexibility in terms of how long I take to speak and what I include in the talk. So my background is actually in molecular biology. I am a musician, but I don't have any particular expertise in digital music. But I've come from experimental molecular biology and chemistry into the area of, I guess, scholarly communications technology in general. When I was a PhD and a researcher in molecular biology, I always looked at computational research and was extremely jealous, because it was clear to me that computational research would be much more reliable, much more reproducible, and it'd be easy to just rerun things. That'd be fine. It'd clearly be much better documented, because all the documentation is there in the system. And it would clearly be, it was apparently much easier to get published at the time as well. And then, of course, over the years, I've spoken to a number of computational researchers. I actually eventually started to learn to do some programming myself, particularly under the influence of Greg Wilson, who was probably one of the world's best teachers of programming. I would say certainly how to think about approaching programming. And I realized that computational researchers look at experimental researchers with a degree of jealousy, thinking that their documentation is so much better, that clearly the standards of reproducibility are so much higher, that the whole system clearly works better, and clearly it's much easier to publish. So we have this sort of odd grass is greener on the other side of the fence situation going on. And that's not particularly surprising. There are actually relatively few people who really bridge that divide. I suspect many of the people in the UK who bridge that divide are in the room today and know exactly how uncomfortable it is trying to straddle those two worlds. And what I want to start with is to suggest that both of those are true. That actually there are examples of extremely good reproducible practice in the experimental sciences, and there are also very good examples of reproducible practice in the computational sciences. But there are tools in the computational sciences that should be used to inspire practice in the experimental research area, and indeed tools and practice in the experimental research area that should be applied more thoroughly to computational research. And if I drift into saying science rather than research, I apologise. a lot of this applies, in my view, to research in general, not to science. And the reason I chose science as a service, as a title, was more to do with the fact that it was nicely alliterative than anything else. So let's start with test-driven design. Test-driven design is hard. Really difficult discipline to get your head around. Setting yourself up with really good, rigid targets up front that are measurable, that are objective, that you can test against when you've built your software. And many of us don't do it very well. I was as guilty of that as anyone else, sort of writing those tests as I go along, writing the code and fiddling with things on the way. But when you apply that discipline, it's a really effective way of knowing that you're finished, a really effective way of not changing your directions halfway through. And it's not so different to what, in my experience as an experimental bench scientist, we just called controls. The things that you would run alongside your experiment to make sure that they worked, that there wasn't something funny going on the back end, that the enzymes weren't dead, that there wasn't a memory leak somewhere. And it's not so different in its practice, actually, to what's evolving in the area of clinical trials, where, for a variety of reasons, it's absolutely critical to set up front how many patients you're enrolling in this trial, what the treatments are, and how you will judge the success or failure of that trial. Is very strongly parallel with really serious test-driven development. Documentation. Again, good practice, bad practice. I think one of the nicest examples of really good practice in computational research recently was a paper from Titus Brown's group. Again, my experience is in the area of molecular biology, so I'll probably pick on those as examples. But this is a research paper where he describes a new method, puts up the preprint in the archive, appropriate for this kind of area of research, and then puts up an EC2 instance, an Amazon machine instance, along with all the scripts set up, to actually not just reproduce the results of the paper, but actually if you take that instance and you run that script, you rebuild the entire paper from the ground up. Tech, data, generate the figures, produce the PDF, which is in the archive. There are great examples of documentation tools that help you build that kind of infrastructure up as you go in a project. And they're exactly the same type of tools that, in a sense, we've very largely failed to develop in experimental research. We tend, as a result of safety regulations and other things, to be in a lab or be in the field taking notes on scraps of paper, on beer mats or whatever's available. And then we go away to write up what we've done at the end of the day when we're finished, the end of the week, or in some cases only when we get round to writing the paper. And yet if we could capture what was happening in real time in the lab, capture the data as it came off the instruments, capture video and audio of what was happening as we went along, as we generated files, as a number of interesting tools enable you to do with pure computational research today. IPython Notebook is an example that I know about a little. Can we draw the inspiration? Can we figure out how to make these things work together? But we can take this, I think, a step further. So we start thinking about continuous integration. This idea that when you change a piece of a software, a component of a software system, that you don't just check it into the repository. That on checking it into the repository, the whole thing gets rebuilt from the ground up. All the tests get run. All the systems get checked. All the dependencies get recompiled. And you check against all the possible things that could go wrong with this one piece you've changed. Now let's imagine we could do that in general for research. Let's imagine continuous integration of the research literature. So when someone submits a paper, the first thing that happens is that it gets tested against the entirety of the corpus of knowledge in that space, and in turn you can tell what is it consistent with, what is it inconsistent with, what is it agree or disagree with, what would have to change, what would have to be revised, what would have to be marked up as actually this supersedes that previous result or adds to that previous result, flagging the fact that someone could now bring these two things together and create a bigger whole out of it. If we could do that, if we had the technology for that, then there's an awful lot more we could do across the whole range of research that sounds like fantasy today. But actually in computational research, these systems exist. I'm sure many of you actually use them on a day-to-day basis. They're not perfect. They're a pain in the butt sometimes. Keeping Hudson running on a day-to-day basis is a full-time job. But it can be done at least with data and code. And most of our research today is data and code and the processing and presentation and analysis of data. That's within reach. And so the real question about why we don't do it, and we don't do it for a variety of reasons. Doesn't get you Nature papers. Always a good reason for not doing something. Probably won't get you tenure. But it might keep you in an academic position by avoiding several of the scandals running around at the moment about data disappearing and not being reproducible, the records missing, the actual analysis being completely wrong. There's some really disturbing studies that come out of the last couple of years showing that something like 30% of clinical medical research, even when you get the data, the statistical conclusions presented in the paper were wrong. The analysis is wrong. And that's on top of the fact that on the experimental side, recently a pharmaceutical company reported that 85% of really important studies published in top-range journals, they tried to replicate in-house. Right? This is a pharmaceutical company. They're not short on resources. They're not short on the interest in trying to make this work. 85% they couldn't reproduce the primary result. Because we don't share the results effectively, because we don't share the data and analysis in ways that enable other people to check and reuse them. We don't certainly share them in a way that enables the automated systems that could be built up to automatically check a lot of this can easily be built. To achieve that sort of world, we need to publish all of the objects that result from the research process. The data, the materials, the process, the software, the scripts, the analysis, and the conclusions, and the ways we've generated the figures and the graphs. So there's a lot of potential in terms of the inspiration of what we can achieve by taking the best of computational software engineering practice and taking the best of what makes up research process. But I want to argue that this is not just about inspiration. This is not just a set of parallels that make a nice story. What I want to suggest is the reason these things parallel each other is because we have moved fundamentally from research as a craft-driven cottage industry where a single person would do a single project to an information industry. The government loves to talk about this notion of the information economy. They don't really understand it. I'm not sure that many of the rest of us do either. But it's very clear that to manage the scale of information we generate as a research community, to figure out how to effectively exploit it, both in the short term for economic gain and in the longer term to build up the kind of knowledge infrastructure that will support applications in the future, that we need to be able to think about how we transfer this information from place to place. How we use it, how we share it, how we discover it, and how we make it possible for as much of this to be automated as is possible. If we accept the idea that research is shifting from this craft, guild type approach to something that is more industrial, to something that is more built around, in some cases, a production line kind of architecture, then it's not surprising that the best practice that comes from an industry that is about handling information, that is about exploiting, discovering, and ensuring the optimal availability of information and process, can tell us about how to create an architecture that supports an efficient research process. When I say craft guild, I use the term advisedly. The PhD thesis is our apprentice work. We create, in the traditional research process, these works, these entire objects that are research papers. And those people who create the most prestigious of those craft works that appear in the most prestigious galleries, are bought by the most prestigious patrons, are the ones who succeed. And so our entire system, our entire architecture of attention, of prestige, is built on the production of these artifacts and their display in galleries, not on the mechanisms for ensuring that the pieces of work are interoperable, are reusable, and are reliable. And the situation we've got ourselves into is one in which they are none of those things. They are beautiful in many cases. They are the kind of things you want to put on your CV and put in front of those grant committees and tenure committees and promotion committees. But in many cases, they're not actually very useful, including the PhD student who comes along next and has to try and repeat the basic work. So my point is that we need to think about how we architect the process of research so that it uses the best aspects of efficient architectures from the information industry. What does that mean in practice? Well, it means that we have to create interchangeable and modular pieces that can be reused and repurposed. It means those pieces have to be available. And if we want them to be exploited in part for commercial gains because part of the funding for research is about economic activity, then they have to be not just available and accessible, but open in the sense that they are available for anyone to use for any purpose. They have to be documented effectively so that they can be used. And they have to be at the right level of granularity. So we don't want to drive this down so that every single little tiny piece is a separate project, separate effort. In the same way that you don't create a single module for every function. You don't separate things down to the nth level. You find the right level of granularity. And again, that's a question of architecture, it's a question of the project, it's a question of the need at hand. But we need to consider and configure these systems as services. In the same way that the web has shifted from centralizing documents and indexes to a set of services where data can be obtained, processed, analysed, process can be grabbed, process can be taken to data. Data can be aggregated at its best when it's working well, which is not often, certainly not in the research space. But it's a little embarrassing that when it comes to managing the scale of data, the heterogeneity of data, the management, the archiving, and the exploitation of data, that we, who are supposed to be the professionals, are out there on a daily basis by Facebook, by Yahoo, simply because they're more focused on getting the right architecture in place to deal with the material that they now have more expertise about than we do. So if we can figure and think about ourselves as creating services and as providing services, services to create data, to obtain data, services to analyze data, services to generate the process, the materials, the studies, the analysis. And indeed, service providers to our funders. What is the service level agreement we have with EPSRC? What is the way to configure our system so that when you do well, you get the next grant, which gets you the next job and the next promotion? So that it's actually in the interests of researchers to create these loosely coupled pieces that get reused, that then get tracked. We don't just need the architecture, we also need the analytics. We don't actually do too badly on that. We're pretty good at tracking citations and that form of reuse. But we're terrible at tracking the reuse of software and the reuse of data. But those analytics, which is, in a sense we're a little bit more comfortable with on the citation side, can at least be applied in a reasonably straightforward fashion to those other kinds of objects. The mechanics are more complicated. So, again, if we accept the notion that the research enterprise has shifted, we can no longer, in most subjects, operate this craft-like, single-person, single genius creating, often with a workshop, which we forget about. Django's workshop, obviously. Same way we forget about the undergraduate students and the PhD students who actually do most of the work in many cases. But if we move away from that workshop, that single creation pipeline within a particular group, within a particular space, and we move to a notion that's inspired at least by the information architectures that we know work well for software engineering, and we figure out how to apply those across to the research space, it won't be a one-to-one transition. There are lots of specific issues to consider along the way. But if we think about that, then we will ultimately push through to this notion of research as a service, as a provision of a set of services where I provide a different set of services to the guy down the hallway, and one institution probably provides a different set of services to another institution. That many of the service providers may be outside of institutions altogether, but because we have an architecture that enables the free exchange of research objects between these resources, we have an efficient way of making that work. But if you accept that method of thinking, if you think that offers some insight into the way we should think about the architecture of the research process, then we have to ask the question, what is the platform that we build these services on? The platform we have is the higher education institution in most cases, the research institute. And the research institute and the higher education institution is a guildhall. It's not a set of services on which you can lay out the services you're going to create. It's not a set of interoperable data standards that would let you take the CV that you wrote for your promotion case and actually find some other use for it, because it requires a different format. EPSRC format versus BBSRC format versus QMUL format versus Southampton format. And that's just one example of a failure of the institution to provide a standard API layer. So, again, if we take this notion that we're talking about building an information architecture that supports the research process, if this is a set of services that build out across a community, then we also need to think about actually fairly radical changes in the way we configure the institutions that provide the platform for that. It's going to be an interesting exercise seeing which institutions survive that transition. We know full well in this country that there are several institutions that are not going to survive the next 5 years. The ones that do are going to have one of two sort of characteristics. They'll either be the extremely prestigious institutions, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, will survive in more or less their current form because they can afford to continue to operate in their current form to a certain extent. And because they have the flexibility, in many ways, to reconfigure parts of themselves to take advantage of the way the world is changing. But other institutions have a really difficult question to face. How do you build the platform that enables researchers, not one that defines what the rules are you have to fall into, not one that demands information in one form one day and in another form another, but one that actually creates an interoperable information architecture which supports the research process from the ground up, and more particularly supports researchers coming together in new groupings, probably cross-institutional groupings, to build new services on this platform layer. I'm not sure what that looks like. I think it looks quite a lot different to the institutions that we have today. And I think there are some really interesting examples out there of institutions trying to go down this route. But it's going to be an interesting process trying to figure out how all this fits together. And I certainly don't want to be on the API standards group. Thank you.
Questions? Tom?
So you talk about sort of the paper as a craft work, but in some cases there's communities within the academic world, such as the particle physics community or the radio astronomy community, who are already producing 100-author papers. So do they have some of these structures already in place, and if so, what can we learn from them?
So it's a good question. So the in a sense, so I know a little bit about particle physics. So I talk to people to try and figure out some of these issues, and in a sense, actually, it becomes actually more guild-like because the way it works in practice is you get personal recommendations. So in the apprentice work, if you like, is actually probably a report or some other piece of work. In some cases, actually, it's a physical object, a detector or an electronics element. And so then you're actually more dependent on your apprentice master to give you a good rep, because it's actually a more closed community. There's a very real sense in which the particle physicists generate papers because that's what the funders require them to do. And it's interesting in that sense, particle physicists are actually unilaterally decided to take control of their publication process. I think that's a whole other set of issues playing out there, which is really quite interesting. So I think where we can learn a bit more is where some of these disciplines meet with engineering. So in engineering, your PhD work tends to be, as far as I understand it, more the creation of an object which often fits into the bigger piece of puzzle. And so that's, I think, an area where we can learn from. The other area actually comes from the industrialization of biology. So with the creation of actually entirely new forms of research institute that enable this kind of specialisation that was actually required. So the Sanger Centre, in its modern form, is an entirely new kind of beast, which did not exist in the early 1990s anywhere in the biological sciences, where you've got hundreds of people specialised in very specific places, very specific training, solving particular parts of the problem and working as a team. It's instructive to look at the career paths of most of the people doing that, and you realise that most of them are technicians. And they have that kind of career path, not a research career path. They still have this sort of group leader thing going on as well. But I think the critical question is the one of how can we celebrate, quality assure, discover high quality work that serves the needs of a research community that isn't a conventional communication. That seems to me the big challenge. And how do you recognise forms of contribution that are valuable to a particular research area when you're in a situation of having to judge that across research areas? Appointment committees to university posts today will not be looking at a single discipline where you're going to be looking across chemistry, across physics, across computer science, with widely differing sets of contributions, and that's a real challenge of how we try and balance those up. What I think will happen is that people start asking the question not who is the best candidate, but how does the set of skills these candidates demonstrate actually fit with what we need. So I hope there'll be a more sort of purposeful thinking about what the needs of institutions are.
Thanks very much. And great talk, thank you. I agree with pretty much everything except I'm a little less sanguine, I think, about where you think things are going, particularly your very last comment actually about how recruitment panels in universities work. I'm definitely nowhere near that at the moment. But the way what I wanted to ask you about was one of the things that, the way I express one of the points that you make is, to young researchers is, what you should really be asking yourself is not how you can best get your research published in Nature or Science, although obviously at the moment that's a good goal because it gets you a job, but how you should best do your research to contribute to the global research effort. It sounds highfalutin, but that's basically what we're talking about. And if you talk to young researchers about that, they say, fantastic, wonderful, they're all altruistic, they think that's the way to go. And if I go, particularly in biology actually, if I go to senior researchers and say this is the way we should go, they say, oh, no, they've got a much more Gollum-like approach to it. It's my data, it's precious. And whilst the research councils are pushing us in this direction to do open science, which I think pretty much everybody here will probably agree with, there's this cultural problem that we're going to have to overcome. And so I can't quite see why you think it's on a 5-year time frame. I'd love to think it is, but I think there's this cultural barrier that's going to take us a lot longer than that to overcome. We need those people to retire. So the 5-year time frame, I meant to refer just to financial issues. Okay. Yeah, we're going to lose 2 or 3 universities in this country because they're going to go broke. Yeah. Okay. I agree with that. Yeah.
So the cultural question is the really hard one. It's the thing that sits at the centre of all this, and it's not simply young versus old either. Because one of the things when you start looking into the sociology and the anthropology of this, the people who are most vociferous about this are people my age, the people who've probably had a permanent position, looking for a way to differentiate themselves, looking to do something a bit different, but have enough job security to be able to get away with it. That said, between jobs possibly tells you something about me, but putting that aside. But we have some quite good evidence actually that so people coming into PhDs have this very altruistic, I'm here to do something about the world, otherwise I would have gone out and got a real job kind of attitude. That sort of tails off as they go into end of a PhD, starting into postdocs, and particularly first permanent positions, so first PR position. Those people are incredibly conservative and they're being strongly acculturated to behave in very specific kinds of ways. That's the key point. I mean, you have wastage at the far end, at the senior end of the spectrum, and indeed, many of the most active advocates of open approaches are actually senior researchers as well, which is great. But the key thing is getting people's attention as they move from postdoc into permanent research post, or indeed as they look at what they want to do as a researcher at the postdoc and contract research level. If we can get those people's attention, and this will happen via funders, to say, actually things are changing, and if you want to be out in front, you've got to take these approaches, and this is the way things are going, and no, we're not going to tell you what the pace is because we can't tell, but you can, there's a way of being out in front of the curve here. Then I think that's where we can make the most difference. And actually that turnover is very fast. So if it becomes clear to people they go into their first permanent position, they get their first grant on the basis of a really good data management plan, and they get recognised for that in the reports on that grant, and then you've got a 2 to 3 year cycle. You can change practice. Hard, but I'm optimistic we're on the right track with that. We've got 3 more questions. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, so mine is actually quite similar, but I would think that I don't believe that it's only cultural. I think it's natural that people want to be better. So I think like we sort of trick politicians who want to be powerful into doing something useful. We have to face the fact that scientists want to be famous and not useful. So we have to trick them into being useful. So I think we have to start. Not have to discourage people to do something that they can get into nature, but we should encourage nature to want to publish that sort of research, which may have been sort of leaked before, because they don't usually want that. But
well, so to be fair to nature, they don't care. Actually, they don't mind at all. So I would. Going back one step, so I think I characterise the psychology slightly differently, in as much as researchers, yes, they want to be famous, they want fame and glory, but they also want to be able to say that they're doing the right thing. So there's a very strong, if we can actually align those two, then that's a very powerful motivator. So I see where you're going with the notion of changing nature. I think nature is actually, at its core, is part of the problem, and there's not really much we can do except get rid of it. What we need to be doing, which is because it's the gallery, it's not substance, it's not the material. The average number of citations a Nature paper gets. Sorry, the median number. I'll get this the wrong way around, but it's about 5 or 6. Right? Most Nature papers are not highly cited. And they have much higher retraction rate from journals with lower impact factor, but that's another story again. But I think in the specifics I disagree, because we need to focus on the work, not where it is. So it's a question of, is the work great? Is the work being reused? So my argument is, if we can actually measure reuse, which we do in part through citation, but we could also do for software and data, then, and if the criterion of quality is how much is this actually being used, then you motivate people selfishly to ensure they create their work in a way which is most reusable. So I disagree with the specifics, but the general sense of, yes, you have to align the incentives. No one's going to change the world by telling everyone they should do the right thing. You have to make the incentives align with doing the right thing.
Well, this sort of picks up on a thread that I think you sort of left hanging. I mean, if in standard, any kind of economics, you change behavior by looking at what the outputs are. Okay, what's our demand and publications? You're talking to the wrong people in a certain sense. You really should be talking to the people who publish the papers, and require that they have these set of standards for things they publish, standards of reproducibility, standards of...
in the sense of the publishers.
Right, yeah.
Yes, but I do that in a very regular
That's how you're
basis.
going to change psychology. You're not going to change psychology from the bottom up.
But so the conversation goes like this. I come to a group like this and say, we should do things differently.
Yeah.
And someone says, well, what we need to do is get the journals or the funders, and it's always one of those two.
Yeah.
Journals or funders need to change what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Go to the journals, they say, just as soon as the community's behind it. And literally, that's the cycle of conversation. It's, you've got to create. So the reality is, journals will shift requirements for publication at the point where funders are in the process of thinking about it hard, and there is enough nascent interest in the research community to say this is something we ought to do. So the classic example that I know reasonably well is protein structures. PDB, that's the database into which protein structures is put, has existed since the 1970s. And it was available from the 1970s. It started off with 6 structures in it. At the beginning of at the end of the late 80s, it had about 40 structures in it. And it took a long time for that community to say, actually, no, we should share the data. And at the point where enough of the key people in that community said we should share the data, then suddenly the journals came on board. So, and the same is true with funders. Funders are terrified of research communities, in the same way that research communities are terrified of funders. It's really fun, and everyone's too afraid to act. Everyone's too afraid to. So, a big part of it is if people say, if there's enough chatter about it being a thing that the community thinks is the right thing to do, then you can get momentum to get publishers and funders to act. But without the two in concert, you don't know where. You can get a lot of cycles talking to publishers about what they should do, and they'll say, we'll do it just as soon as the researchers ask for it.
Hello, I'm Robin from Sheffield. I don't want it to be destructive or anything, but I think there are two big fundamental flaws of that approach. The first is, I've always heard the saying, like putting academics in a room and trying them to do something together is like herding cats. So, and you said that before, everybody thinks he's doing the right thing. So I think there's a fundamental problem in getting scientists as a group to adhere to certain structures. Mm-hmm. Because if they won't agree with them, they won't use them. So that's the first fundamental thing. And the only way you could solve that is probably by completely change the personalities that go into research. And I don't know whether you want that, because it's creating people who want to do what they're doing, and of course in the way they're doing things. And so being a researcher and being that way seems fundamentally disjoint from that form of doing it. And the second thing is, if you have modules and if you create such a structure, then you said before you don't want to sit on the committee, and I kind of understand that, because in that committee there'll be interests of people, and these interests will strongly influence whatever platform comes out. And you said before Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, and they will basically say what it will look like, and all the others will go, okay, now we'll have to try to do that. It won't be the small ones who are doing everything right. It will be the big ones who at least will screw the whole thing into a direction, and that won't be, the outcome won't be as good as you idealistically set it out to be. And all these flaws will then necessarily influence everybody else's work, because everybody will have to work that way.
As opposed to what we do at the moment, when the existing, I mean, I agree. There's nothing in there that I can disagree with.
Yeah.
What I'm broadly arguing is that we can do better. We'll have a different set of flaws. But we have, so I mean, you made a classic statement. It seems that people of a particular type are drawn to research. That's a particular character type, and I could just as easily say, well, then it's clear that we shouldn't do anything about having white middle-aged male people who went and did PhD at Oxford in the cabinet, because it's clearly those two character types. That's just the way it is. So I think in part there's a value in actually just increasing diversity. One of the, I mean, to go off a completely different tangent, but one of the very interesting things about looking at positive discrimination, particularly gender discrimination in appointments committees, is that when you actually push for positive discrimination, you generally tend to get better candidates, because you actually attract more a greater diversity. You're pulling from a different pool. Now that doesn't particularly address the issue of the people we have in the room at the moment, and I think in part what I was trying to say earlier was you don't try and get everyone in the room. You get a small group of people with loud enough voices who can bring the community with them into a room and get them to say something. Then you go to someone else and say, well, they said that, so you should say this, and they say, okay, well, we'll say that. And then you go back to a different group of people and say, well, the journal's saying that, so you wouldn't want to disagree with that, would you? And they say, no, we want, and you build up the process. But at the end of the day, we're talking about humans. It'd be great. We could take all the humans out of the research process. It'll run perfectly. But that's not going to happen too soon. And so the question for me is, how do you configure the system so that the elements of competition, the elements of selfishness, are actually harnessed as effectively as you can to a system which provides, in the end, the optimal return on investment for what is basically a public investment in research? How do we at least say we've done the best we can at taking £4 billion a year and turning it into research outputs of one sort or another? Because we've got to come up with a pretty principled, evidence-based argument that we're doing things the right way, rather than just saying, well, this is the way we've always done it in the past.
I think on that note, let's thank Cameron again. Thank you.